On a dry afternoon in March of 1989, 16-year-old Sarah O'Brien walked into the county planning office in Napa Valley, California, and filed something that immediately started a rumor. She filed a permit to plant 500 blackthorn bushes around her family's 80-acre vineyard. The clerk behind the counter looked at the application twice, then a third time. Finally, he looked up. "You're planting a hedge of thorns around a vineyard?" Sarah nodded. 500 of them. "That's right." The clerk laughed. Not a small laugh. A real laugh. The kind of laugh people make when they think they've just heard the most ridiculous thing of the week. Blackthorn bushes around grapes. Nobody did that. Nobody had ever done that. At least not in Napa Valley. The clerk stamped the permit anyway. Money was money. Even when the customer appeared to be making a terrible mistake. By sunset, 3 farmers had heard the story. By the next morning, 30 had heard it. By Sunday, everyone in town knew. And before planting season ended, Sarah O'Brien had a nickname to harvest. Thorn Girl. People didn't mean it as a compliment. They meant it as a joke. Every time they said it, somebody laughed. Sarah never laughed. But she never got angry either. She simply planted her bushes and went back to work because she wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. She was trying to save something that everyone else had already given up on. To understand why Sarah planted a hedge of thorns around a vineyard, you need to understand what happened to her grandmother. In 1965, Margaret O'Brien was considered one of the most successful vineyard owners in Napa County. She owned over 200 acres, 3 tractors, a new harvester, a large wine storage cellar. People admired her, some envied her, most respected her. Then the wildfires came. The vineyard wasn't prepared. Neither was Margaret. Almost overnight, everything burned. The vines weren't ready. The insurance wasn't enough. The bank didn't care that the fire was an act of God. The bank still wanted its money. Sarah was 8 years old at the time. Old enough to understand what was happening. Young enough to be terrified. She watched her grandmother transform from a confident businesswoman into a worried woman who barely slept. Every evening Margaret sat at the kitchen table surrounded by insurance papers and rebuilding estimates. Every morning she woke up worried. For 3 years the pressure never stopped. The family survived barely. But Sarah learned something important. A vineyard depending on one defense wasn't really a business. It was a gamble, a very expensive gamble. Most farmers never admitted it. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about it. Years later, after taking over the operation, she kept asking herself the same question. What happens when the fire comes? Nobody had a good answer. What happens when the drought follows? Nobody had a good answer. What happens when the insurance doesn't cover everything? Nobody had a good answer. The usual response was always the same. That's farming. Sarah hated that answer because it wasn't an answer at all. It was an excuse. One winter evening in 1988, Sarah was cleaning out her grandmother's attic. Most grandchildren ignored those old spaces. Sarah didn't. She liked finding things. In a corner beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets, she found a wooden chest. The lock had rusted away. When she lifted the lid, the smell hit her first. Cedar and old paper. Then the handwriting. Her great-grandmother's handwriting. Delicate, slanted, pressed deep into the pages with a fountain pen. Bridget O'Brien, born in 1898, died in 1962. A woman Sarah had only known from a single black and white photograph on the mantel. Stern-faced and braided, wearing a dress that looked like it could stand up on its own. But in those journals, Bridget was alive. She was talking, and she was talking about hedges. Not the neat trimmed hedges that line the driveways of modern vineyards. Not the decorative borders that landscape architects designed for beauty. Blackthorn hedges. Dense, thorny, impenetrable walls of Prunus spinosa that had protected Irish farms for centuries. Thick enough to stop a running bull. Dense enough to block the wind that carried fire across open land. Deep-rooted enough to hold soil against erosion when everything else washed away. The concept fascinated Sarah. After she finished reading, she spent the entire winter studying them. The science was surprisingly convincing. Blackthorn grew fast, 6 feet in 2 years. It created a microclimate, cooler and more humid, that protected vines from heat stress. The thorns deterred deer that ate young grape shoots. The dense branches slowed wind that spread fungal spores. And most importantly, the deep roots held water and nutrients that vines could access in drought years. The more Sarah learned, the more obvious something became. Nobody in Napa Valley had even considered it. Not because it didn't work, Because nobody had tried. And nobody had tried because everyone assumed somebody else already knew best. That spring, Sarah decided to test the idea. Not on her entire vineyard, just the perimeter. 500 blackthorn bushes, 1 hedge, 1 experiment. Her neighbors immediately noticed. The vineyard looked unusual. From the road, rows of grapevines, then a wall of thorn bushes, a pattern nobody recognized. One afternoon, her neighbor Robert Harrison stopped his truck beside the field. Robert had farmed for 40 years. He considered himself an expert. He climbed out and stared across the rows. "What in the world are you doing?" "Trying something different," Sarah said. Robert laughed. "Different doesn't always mean smart. Maybe you know why nobody plants like this." Sarah smiled. "Tell me." "Because it doesn't work." "Have you tried it?" "No." "Do you know anyone who has?" "No." "Then how do you know?" Robert didn't answer because he couldn't. He simply shook his head and drove away. That conversation repeated itself dozens of times. Different farmers, different locations, same reaction. Everybody knew it would fail. Nobody knew why. Planting season ended. Summer arrived. And something interesting happened. The blackthorn grew fast. 6 inches in the first month. 2 feet by July. The hedge was dense, thorny, a wall of green that separated the vineyard from the road. The soil beneath it stayed cooler. Weeds struggled. Moisture lasted longer than expected. Visitors noticed. Even critics noticed. But nobody wanted to admit it. Not yet. Because appearances mean nothing in farming. Harvest means everything. When harvest finally arrived, Sarah felt nervous. Months of work would soon be measured in numbers. The pickers moved through the vineyard. The grapes yielded well, better than average, significantly better. The microclimate near the hedge had created cooler conditions that preserved acidity in the fruit. The thorn barrier had kept deer away. The deep roots had accessed water that vines alone couldn't reach. When Sarah finished calculating the results, she stared at the numbers for several minutes. The experiment had generated nearly 30% more premium fruit than a traditional vineyard. 30%. 1 field, 1 hedge, 1 harvest. The numbers spread quickly. Some farmers were surprised. Others claimed it was luck. A few insisted weather conditions explained everything. Nobody wanted to admit the obvious possibility. Maybe Sarah was on to something. The following year, she planted more. 800 bushes, then 1,000, then 1,500. Every season produced similar outcomes. Improved fruit quality, reduced irrigation costs, better soil structure, more stable production. Gradually the laughter began disappearing. Not entirely, but enough. The nickname remained. Yet its meaning changed. People no longer laughed when they called her Thorn Girl. Now they sounded curious, sometimes even respectful. Then came 1991, the year that changed everything. California entered one of the worst wildfire seasons in decades. The dry winds came early. The temperatures soared. The hills above Napa Valley caught fire on a Sunday afternoon, and by Monday morning the flames had traveled 15 miles. Vineyard after vineyard burned. Robert Harrison was among the hardest hit. For years he had planted only grapes. For years it worked. Then the wildfire came. His vines burned in hours. His equipment melted. His storage cellar collapsed. His profit vanished almost overnight. Expenses remained. The mortgage remained. Equipment payments remained. Nothing else changed except the income. One evening, Robert arrived at Sarah's house. Sarah immediately knew something was wrong. Robert looked exhausted, older, defeated. They sat at the kitchen table. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Robert broke the silence. "I might lose the vineyard." Sarah nodded slowly. "I'm sorry." Robert stared down at his coffee. "So am I." The room became quiet again. Then Robert asked the question he had spent years avoiding. "Tell me about the blackthorn." Sarah smiled softly. "The blackthorn." Robert nodded. "The blackthorn. The same bushes he once laughed at. The same thorns everyone mocked. Now they represented survival." Sarah spent 3 hours explaining everything. Planting methods, spacing, pruning, soil management, irrigation timing. Robert listened carefully. When he finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. "I should have listened years ago." Sarah shook her head. "No." "What do you mean?" "You listened when it mattered." The following spring, Robert planted blackthorn hedges. So did 4 other farmers. The year after that, 10 more joined them. Then 20, then 30. The idea spread rapidly. Not because it was fashionable, because it worked. Success has a way of attracting attention, especially during hard times. By the late 1990s, university researchers began studying Sarah's hedges. They collected soil samples, measured moisture levels, analyzed fruit quality, reviewed fire behavior. The findings were impressive. Blackthorn hedges reduced fire risk, improved resilience, enhanced soil health, increased vineyard profitability over time. Researchers published papers. Agricultural magazines wrote articles. Extension agents discussed the results. The same practice once considered foolish was now receiving scientific recognition. Sarah found that amusing. One reporter asked how it felt to become famous. Sarah laughed. "I'm not famous. Your methods are being studied across multiple states, so that's a big deal." Sarah shrugged. "I was just trying to keep the vineyard." The reporter waited for more. That was all she got. Years passed. The vineyard continued thriving. Not every season was perfect. There were droughts, floods, pest outbreaks, market crashes. Nothing about farming became easy. But Sarah had built resilience into the system. When fire threatened, the hedge slowed it. When drought came, the deep roots found water. When deer arrived, the thorns stopped them. The vineyard no longer depended on a single outcome. And that made all the difference. In 1998, Sarah's daughter, Emma, returned home after college. Like her mother, she loved agriculture. Like her mother, she enjoyed asking questions. One evening, the two women stood beside a hedge watching the sunset. Rows of blackthorn glowed gold beneath the fading light. Grapes hung heavy on the vines below. Emma looked across the field. "Did people really laugh at this?" Sarah smiled. "Oh, yes." "Why?" "Because it was different. That's all. Usually that's enough." Emma thought about that, then asked another question. "Were you ever scared?" Sarah laughed softly. "Every day." "Then why continue?" Sarah looked across the horizon. "Because I wasn't afraid of failing. I was afraid of never trying." Years later, Emma took over the vineyard. The methods remained. The philosophy remained. The results remained. Visitors still arrived asking questions. Students still toured the hedges. Researchers still collected data. And every season, someone asked the same thing. Why plant a hedge of thorns around grapes? Emma always gave the same answer. Because one row of vines is a hope. A hedge of blackthorn is a wall. Sarah O'Brien passed away peacefully in 2011. Her funeral filled the church beyond capacity. Farmers came from 3 counties. Researchers attended. Former critics attended. Old friends attended. Nearly everyone had a story about Sarah. Many remembered the laughter. Many remembered the jokes. Many remembered calling her Thorn Girl. The pastor mentioned it during the service. People smiled because they remembered. Then the pastor said something nobody forgot. Some women follow tradition because it feels safe. He paused. Others respect tradition but still ask questions. The church became silent. Sarah O'Brien asked questions. Another pause. When everyone planted grapes, she planted thorns. When everyone laughed, she kept planting. When wildfires came, she had a wall. The congregation nodded because it was true. Outside the church, conversations continued for hours. Stories were shared, lessons remembered, lives celebrated. One elderly farmer summed it up best. She wasn't smarter than everybody. Someone asked what he meant. The old farmer smiled. She was just willing to look foolish longer than the rest of us. Today, the O'Brien vineyard remains active. Emma runs it with her children. The hedges still produce blackthorn and protect grapes together. Students still visit. Farmers still learn. The legacy continues. And on a simple gravestone overlooking the Napa Valley, beneath Sarah's name and the years of her life, there is an inscription chosen by her family. Just 9 words. She built a wall when others planted rows. Every spring those words come alive again. Bushes enter the soil. Green shoots emerge. Blackthorn rises, grapes hang heavy, one harvest grows protected by a wall, and somewhere in that California wind, the lesson remains. Never assume the crowd is right. Never reject an idea simply because it's unfamiliar. And never forget that the people laughing today may someday be asking how you did it. Because when the hard years arrived, when wildfires came, when vineyards disappeared, Sarah O'Brien wasn't saved by luck. She was saved by preparation. One row of grapes gave her income. The Hedge of Blackthorn gave her security. Together they gave her something every farmer hopes for. A future. And sometimes the future begins the moment you decide to plant differently.